Race relations is a very difficult topic to address.
The conversation often leads to misunderstandings, disputes, and online debates.
We created this film because we believe it has valuable insights for the Seventh-day Adventist Church today.
However, its purpose is not to attack any person or institution, but to ignite a conversation of reconciliation in the church.
Thanks for watching. God bless. So I love to jog. And about a month ago, I was jogging in my neighborhood, slipped on some black ice, and fell on my knee. I got up, ran to my apartment, turned on the light, looked down, and I see this massive wound on my leg. Now, I don't have a medical background, but I know enough to know the steps I need to take in order to heal a wound. So, I cleaned the wound, got all the dirt out the way. Secondly, I treated the wound, I put some ointment on it, and then I protected the wound by putting a bandage on it. And these steps were imperative to make sure my knee did not get infected and that the wound healed. Contrary to what many people may feel, the Seventh-day Adventist Church body has a massive wound, and this wound is racism and prejudice. In the last 8 months, I've had the privilege of interviewing several professors, lay people, pastors, and administrators, and have learned some valuable insights regarding this topic, and got it all on camera. My name is Andrew Ashley, and this is The Wound. Hi, my name is Andrew Ashley. I'm a vlogger, a social media personality, and a preacher. I'm also a black male who grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I've always been aware of the racial tension in the church, but haven't always known how to handle it. And then I realized that until I understood the historical context of this issue, I wouldn't have the insight to create solutions. That is to say, you have to clean the wound out before you can treat it. From the very beginning of Adventism, of the Adventist Church, what did race relations look like, if there was any such thing as race relations at all?
The Millerites, the movement out of which Adventism grew, a number of them had been prominent abolitionists. Charles Fitch, who worked closely with William Lloyd Garrison. John Byington, who became the first General Conference president, operated an Underground Railroad station. Joseph Bates had been active in the abolition movement. William Miller, although he didn't become a Seventh-day Adventist, of course, was the spark plug of the Millerite movement.
Ellen White was definitely an abolitionist. Very radical indeed, and it was civil disobedience. There was laws on the book that said that anybody who is benefiting an escaped slave is against the law of the country. And whereas she was not running an underground railroad herself, but she was definitely in favor of, spoke in favor of, and worked in favor of abolitionist tendencies and abolitionist goals. So she was definitely fighting against the law of the country.
I think it was highly radical for Ellen White and our founders to be abolitionists, not from a denominational perspective, but based on an ethnic perspective and a national perspective. So we must understand that Adventism is an American institution, which means our founders are Americans, and predominantly they are white Americans or Caucasian Americans. So at this time, for a Caucasian American to champion the cause of Black Americans in this country was a radical thing. So on that premise, we can build quite the foundation and the support for how radical of a move it was.
I believe that she and others of her time, the early founders of Adventism, saw all people the same way that God did, created in the image of God. So as such, all people are to be seen and treated the same, regardless of where they're from or their station in life.
So Ellen White and the pioneers were abolitionists and believed that we were all created equal in God's eyes. So what went wrong?
The Seventh-day Adventist Church grew up in New England and the upper Midwest. It hadn't really penetrated the South until after the Civil War. Adventists had a hard time penetrating the South.
In trying to establish Adventism in the South, there was almost immediately difficulties because the Adventists themselves, the Seventh-day Adventists themselves, were not differentiating between who they were trying to evangelize. And in the South, white-black issues were front and center and massively a part of every conversation.
They were afraid that the Adventists were going to try to bring racial justice to the South. A lot of our early ministers going to the South were just really gung-ho on the idea of equal rights, and they didn't try to segregate black and white, and they soon ran into a lot of problems.
The initial push into the South by Adventist evangelists were not planning to be segregated, but immediately found that they had segregated audiences. So if they were to try to get white folks to come to a meeting, they had to address white folks. If they were trying to get black folks to come to a meeting, they had to address black folks. And there was no meeting that both would come to. And that's the reality, in my understanding, that they discovered. And unfortunately, then, for the most part, Adventists went on to evangelize mostly the whites.
But there was one particular white man who found it his calling to be a voice and a resource to the black community. Ellen White's son, Edson White.
He recognized that here is a group of people that were not being met with the gospel. And of course, he very much feels, go into all the world to all peoples. When he went determined to reach the blacks. Among the largely white Northern Adventists, he was in a minority who was feeling the urge to get evangelism, the gospel, to the blacks of the South. So he very early on had difficulty raising money for the project. Quite frankly, there was special money donated by his mother to make the project work.
Edson White's attempt to minister to the black people in the South. So he takes the Morning Star riverboat down the river, and white Adventists meet him there and try to run him off because he is trying to bring the gospel to black people.
And again, a mob came in, rode the white principal out of town on a rail, nailed shut the doors and windows, burned the textbooks and maps, and gave one of the black brothers that had been associated with them a whipping with the old slave whips.
Wow.
Shut down the school.
Now, can you take us to the 20th century, right? So Ellen White, and the church leaders, many of them are dying off at this point, and we're into the 20th century, and we're in the 30s, 40s, 50s. What's going on with Adventism and race relations around then?
When the Southern racist Woodrow Wilson became president of the United States, he found D.C. integrated. He found the government offices integrated. The blacks and whites could eat in the same government cafeterias. And he ordered segregation. And the General Conference also, at this point, did some segregating.
There was racial segregation at the GC in the cafeteria where black people and brown people were told to eat over here, and white GC officials were allowed to eat in a different area.
Even in 1926, when another proposal came that advocated black conferences, there was a committee of about 16 people put together, 11 whites and 5 blacks. The recommendation came, it was discussed, and it was dismissed, and the black leadership was told at that point, don't even bring it up anymore. So that, once again, was a bit of an effort to sort of squelch, as it were, all of this discussion.
So we see that in Adventism, just as it was in secular society, we had a denomination that embraced the bigotry of the nation. And because of that, you had our system, our denominational system of administrators, pastors, leaders, etc. That system was benefiting or advantaging white Adventist leaders over black Adventist leaders. So this was not only creating a ceiling that limited how far up the ladder a black practitioner could go, but it was also creating a disparity at the local level, whether it be in our hospitals, whether it be in our churches.
There was a white person over the colored work, decision making at the highest levels about what should happen with colored schools and colored congregations was being made by white people. And this was very irksome to those who recognize, the black people recognizing that those who did not understand were making decisions for them.
For example, on the campus of what was known, some years back as Oakwood College, even Oakwood College had white presidents at the time, and the students rose up and said, we want one of our own, to be president of our school. And that changed around 1932 when Pastor Moran became the first black president of Oakwood College.
In the Southern's case, I've been told that the Ku Klux Klan actually monitored the school.
Wow.
When people came over from Oakwood, performers or whatever, they made sure that they did not stay in the same dormitory room as white kids.
Wait. Let me stop you for a second. The KKK was monitoring the school.
That's
you
what
said in the 40s? This is the 40s, 50s?
40s, 50s, yeah.
50s, making sure black students aren't coming.
Making sure that when blacks come from other campuses, that they don't integrate, don't stay in a dormitory room with a white kid or something like that.
The early 1900s was a very unpleasant time to be a black person in the Adventist church. But that unpleasantness took an even darker turn with an event that would change the church forever.
One of the episodes that really gave more credence to this was in the Washington, D.C. area, the Lucy Byard incident.
Her name was Lucille Lewis Byard.
Where a black woman who was quite light-skinned was mistaken for not being black.
An Adventist woman by the name of Lucy Byard, a woman of color, is needing medical attention and goes to a hospital in Washington, D.C. This is way back in the 40s. And as she's taken into the hospital, they look at her and they believe her to be a white woman, so they decide that they're going to serve her. But then they look at her information and it says that she is a person of color. She's a black person. And instead of serving her and attending to her medical needs, they put her out onto the stairs of this hospital, this Adventist hospital. The Adventists are doing this. And she dies on those stairs in front of our Adventist hospital.
And one of the General Conference officials had, and I'm not sure whether this happened before or afterwards, applauded Washington sanitariums, apparently thinking that if they started to accept black patients, they might drive the white patients away.
And that was, once again, another thing that just sort of led to this. So by the time you got to around 1944, the momentum had really kicked in that said, you know what, perhaps black conferences, so-called black conferences, regional conferences, would be a way to spur additional growth in the Adventist church.
Swing your chariots, let's be right. My home is over Jordan. Swing your chariots, let's be right. I wanna cross over Jordan. Swing your chariots, let's be right. Over Jordan. Swing your chariots, let's be right.
Well, it didn't affect the West Coast. Before that, we had had some separate churches, but now you had official conference organizations, which had some positive results, gave African Americans leadership experience, and they were able to more effectively reach the inner city than they probably would have if they had to deal with a white bureaucracy.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it was a good thing. I'm saying there were some good
There
results.
were some good results.
Yeah.
Some schools, Adventist schools, they had quotas as to how many black students. This is in the 60s. This was just the other day. In the 60s, had quotas of how many black students come to their university, their Adventist university.
When students came that they didn't realize were black until they got there, they tried to send them home.
That is so fascinating to me because once again, the most, I feel like many Adventists think themselves like, oh yeah, we had racial issues like back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, you know, but things got better. But we're talking about 60s. You know, you said you were even going to school at this time when a lot of these things were happening. What happened when black students would try to go to white churches?
Well, there were deacons that would bar them from entering. And in one incident, either an elder or a deacon stood at the door and said, I've got a revolver and there's 6 bullets here, and I can use them on 6, and he said the N-word.
There was a time when a black person could come to a Seventh-day Adventist church, and if it was predominantly white, they would then instruct them to go to the predominantly black church that might have been a few miles away. That was a reality within our church.
A woman that I knew was New Adventist, and she was passing out literature about evangelistic meetings, inviting people to come to the meetings, and this is in the 60s. And she was told, if a black person comes to the door, don't invite them to the meetings, just give them a piece of literature.
Wow. Cleaning the wound gives context, and context provides insights in going forward. This is the story of how the church received this wound. This is the history of the black people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
So the black worship experience had to develop within a context where it was not fully accepted. And black leadership had to develop in a context where it was not fully accepted.
Come when you are able to haystack out my table.